Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be filming a video that is replacing a video I was planning on doing today. So I was originally planning on doing a video that I kind of hinted at a few weeks ago that had to do, at least in part, with one of the characters from Adam Bede by George Eliot. I mentioned in my vlog that I was planning to do it, and I was really excited. Still am excited, but I feel like I haven't had a chance to really organize my thoughts for that video. But this video that I'm filming today on the Brontës, as you could tell from the title, I have a lot more idea of what I want to talk about. So we're just going to do that. I will say this video was actually inspired by me recently watching the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. What a mouthful. Anyway, I recently watched that film on Netflix and really enjoyed it, and there's a wonderful scene that's probably my favorite scene in the whole film of them debating who's the better Brontë sister. And so it's got me thinking about what would I say the best Brontë sister would be. Now, I should start off by saying that this is not going to be purely subjective, because I'm not going to be ranking them based on my personal enjoyment of them, and I'll make that clear as we go along that it's definitely, this ranking that I'm about to give you is not based on my personal tastes, but it's based on what I see other people's reactions to each of these authors to be, and how I interpret that in relation to each of the other Brontës, if that makes sense. But that being said, there's still subjectivity in that. Like, I'm still interpreting other people's opinions based on my own experience. So there could be a lot, it's not like I'm looking at every single person who has ever read any of these books and their reactions to them. Basically, it's not going to be super subjective, and I'm not ranking them based on my personal preference, but it's still opinion based. Like, this is still me just coming at it with my own thoughts, and I would love to invite discussion. So if you have any comments about this topic, any thoughts, any differing opinions, please put them down below, because I really would love to hear other people's thoughts on this. I think it will be an interesting discussion if people are willing to participate. So anyway, let's get into this video. So I'm going to start off by just right off saying who amongst the Brontës I think is the master among masters. And that may sound strange, but the other two that are kind of not taking the place of master among masters, I struggle knowing how to rate them, and we're going to discuss that in the second half of the video. So the first half will be me just fighting for the fact that I believe Emily Brontë, author of Wuthering Heights, is the master among masters. Now, this is evidence right off of why this isn't completely subjective to me, because my favorite Brontë sister is Anne Brontë. So I'm not saying Emily is my favorite, but I think based on the overall reaction I see regarding Wuthering Heights and her poetry, I would say she is the master among masters. The primary reason for this is because everybody who ever reads Wuthering Heights has some sort of passionate feeling towards the story. They either feel like, oh, the characters are awful, or they feel like the characters are so fascinating, the story, the atmosphere just gets to people. I actually, in preparation for this video, looked at the Goodreads ratings and reviews for Wuthering Heights versus Jane Eyre specifically, and with Wuthering Heights you see so many passionate comments. And the ratings themselves are all over the map. You have 5 stars, you have 2 and 1 stars, you have 3 stars, but even the 3-star ratings, there's so many 3-star ratings that still have a dedicated review. And I feel like most of the time when I look at reviews on books on Goodreads, most of the time people who put a 3-star either have very neutral things to say, or they don't tend to say anything. Like, you don't see very many reviews in the review section that were 3-star ratings. It's usually higher stars or lower stars that get more time spent on reviewing them, actually writing out a review for them. Now, that's not always the case, but you tend to see that more. At least I've noticed that. But with Wuthering Heights, regardless of what rating it received, people always had strong things to say about it. Even the one-liners were like, all these awful people creating misery for themselves and others, and that's like all they say, but like those are strong words to describe this book. And I just feel like there's something to be said that 200 years later, Wuthering Heights still receives this same amount of passionate criticism, whether that be in favor or being negative about the book. There's still such strong opinions regarding this book, and it creates strong reactions in people. For someone who is mostly a poet, there's something really powerful in her ability to be able to do that. And even relating to her poetry, I feel like most people end up really enjoying it. I know for me, I'm not a huge poetry reader, but Emily Bronte's poetry really speaks to me personally. And I feel like Emily Bronte's poetry is not nearly as well discussed, at least in the circles and things I've looked at. But when it is discussed, most people seem to enjoy it. Now, in comparing the reviews for Wuthering Heights versus Jane Eyre has a lot more love for it. And I think many people would say that puts Jane Eyre higher than Wuthering Heights, and I could definitely see that. But there's still not quite as much passion in the reviews of Jane Eyre, except for like the obvious love and the obvious like 1-star ratings. But there are very few like middling reviews, at least when I was looking through it. And the middling reviews tend to not be quite as passionate as they are for Wuthering Heights. So that's one reason why I think Wuthering Heights may or should be seen as higher, just because it does create such passionate feelings in everybody who reads it, not just specifically people who really love it or really hate it, if that makes sense. The other reason I'm not putting Charlotte up top, and we'll get more into this in a moment, is because Charlotte has 3 other books, and none of those 3 books are nearly as well loved as Jane Eyre. Like, there's a huge gap between the amount of love for Jane Eyre and the amount of love for Charlotte's other books. Not that love is non-existent for her other books, but there's less of it, and I think there's something to be said for that. Granted, you could also argue, well, Emily only wrote the 1 novel, and yes, she's written poetry, so we have a sort of idea of other things she could have written, but we don't really know. And I think that's very true, but we have to go based on what we do have. And based on what we do have, the strong feelings Emily evokes, not only in Wuthering Heights, but also in her poetry for her readers, is very strong. And it's been 200 years since she wrote those, and they still have such an impact. And I feel like if she had been able to write more, I would very strongly believe that, unlike Charlotte, who I feel like wrote this wonderful gothic, kind of creepy and interesting and sort of supernatural story in Jane Eyre, and then she went on to write her other 3 books. Now, I have full disclosure, I haven't read Villette or The Professor yet, so I don't know if there's any gothicness in those. However, I've never heard anybody say anything about there being a gothic supernatural element in those, and the atmosphere I've never heard much talked about in those books. And I've read Shirley, and that's definitely doesn't have the same amount of supernatural great atmosphere that Jane Eyre has. And so it's almost like Charlotte backtracked, like she's got those strong reactions to Jane Eyre mostly because of that atmosphere that it creates and the supernatural elements and the creepiness, and she almost pulled back and started writing other types of things that didn't have that in there. But that's really what makes Jane Eyre so great, is this atmosphere and passionate characters that you just don't see quite as much in her other works, at least as far as I've read and as far as I've heard other people talk about. Whereas I feel like Emily would have continued in that strain of creating that great atmosphere in her other works if she had been able to. Again, we don't really know for sure if that's the case, but I feel like she probably would have. I think that she would have kept up the strength of her writing and storytelling in a way that I don't think Charlotte really did. So yes, I believe Emily Brontë should take the cake for master among masters of the Brontë sisters. However, moving into Charlotte versus Anne, this is where I kind of struggle a little bit because I don't really know who to place over who. And the reason kind of connects back to the idea of Charlotte wrote Jane Eyre, which is so well loved, even more well loved probably than Wuthering Heights in many ways, which is why it's a contender, at least as far as the books themselves go. Jane Eyre is a contender for being the best of the Brontes novels. However, she has 3 other books that just aren't nearly as well loved. Again, some people do really like her other works. Some people even say, I've heard people say Villette was their favorite Bronte work. I've heard people say, or at least one person, Lucy the Reader, say that Shirley is her favorite. So it's not impossible. Definitely personal taste comes into it. But on the whole, most people seem to think that Jane Eyre is the best and the other 3 just really fall short. Like, the gap between how great Jane Eyre is and then where the other 3 are is pretty big. And so that's why it's difficult for me to say, because on the other hand, Anne Bronte's work, she wrote 2 novels, and while they're not nearly as widely read, those who do read Anne's work usually enjoy both of them. I've heard very, very few strongly negative opinions about either the Tenant of Wildfell Hall or even Agnes Grey, which when I read Agnes Grey is my favorite personally, but I could see it being one that a lot of people put very low down in their ranking because it's kind of a slower story, like not as much happens. But I think there's just something about Anne's writing style that makes it so much more enjoyable than you might otherwise think. And so that being said, I just feel like if everybody who reads both of Anne Bronte's works seem to enjoy both of them, even then some of Charlotte's work. So it's hard for me because, again, while Charlotte has Jane Eyre, which would automatically, it feels like, should automatically put her very high up in the ranking amongst the 3 sisters. However, she has 3 other books that are just not as successful and are books that honestly I don't think very many people would read if it weren't for Jane Eyre in the first place. And so there's something very much to be said about, okay, she has this, but then there's kind of that like neutralizing effect as far as Charlotte's personal, her as a writer as a whole, skill level seems to kind of be neutralized because Jane Eyre is so amazing, but then these other 3 books, even if her writing, I will say her writing seems to get better with like Shirley as far as what I read, but the storytelling and the atmosphere isn't the same, and all those things are what combine to make Jane Eyre great, and the other 3 just lack that, and so it kind of neutralizes where her skill level is at. However, Anne Bronte is not nearly as well read. Most people would put Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights over both of Anne Bronte's work, and yet people who read both of Anne Bronte's novels tend to enjoy both of them. There's a lot less disappointment with her books, and maybe that's partly because she doesn't have a Jane Eyre to make it harder, but I also just feel like that Anne Bronte just has a more consistent and strong writing style. In fact, not only consistent, but she actually clearly gets better at telling stories, because Agnes Grey was her first one, and then we have Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is so much more well-loved and better received. And that just shows that she was really improving not only in writing skill, but also in storytelling skill and creating atmosphere and creating characters. And there's something to be said for that. If she had lived longer and had been able to write more, would she have been able to continue to be that consistent with her writing and storytelling? Whereas with Charlotte, we have seen that she just wasn't as consistent with her powerful storytelling and her imagination. I mean, it's hard to say that because she was an adult, she had different experiences and different values at that point, and so she was kind of, her idea of what she wanted to write was changing, which is just fine. But I don't know, there's just, Jane Eyre is just different from her other 3 books, and it makes it hard to know which of the 2 are better. So anyway, I'm not going to rank those 2 because I really have no idea how to organize them. I may say Charlotte first just because I know Jane Eyre is so well loved that it's hard for me to put Anne above her. But again, taking their work as a whole, it's really hard to decide between them, in my opinion. So anyway, that is my discussion video on that. Like I said, Anne is my favorite, so even though kind of in this ranking I hinted that maybe I would put her at the bottom, for me personally, she's my favorite. She connects with me the most, but I do think Emily has the most to offer as far as a writer, and that Charlotte is also pretty high up there, and it's hard to really decide between Charlotte and Anne from a more objective perspective, but again, I mean, it's not fully objective. So anyway, that is my thought on that. Let me know down below, please, your thoughts on this video, if you would rank them in a certain way, or if you struggle knowing how to rank them as well. I would love, love, love to know. If you have a favorite Brontë novel, please let me know what that is, especially if it's one of the other Charlotte Brontë novels, because I'd love to hear more about why, what puts that above some of the others, like especially Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights for you. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!